Hi again. So we began with this question of who controls the media, and I'm now going to offer an alternative answer to that question. Alternative to the answer offered by Marx and his intellectual successors. And this is from Monroe Price, who's a professor of law and communications who spent the last 5 decades or so studying the media, especially television, and specifically the way that the media are regulated. Price agrees with the Marxists that powerful elites seek to control the media so that they can ensure that the news of the day and culture more generally shapes the views of the masses and serves those elites' interests. But what he disagrees with is the idea that those elites are monolithic and purely class-based. In Price's view, there are numerous different factions, both in the government and outside of it, who are players in the game, or as he puts it, sellers in the market of loyalties. In this market for loyalties, Price writes, and I quote, "Large-scale competitors for power in a shuffle of allegiances often use the regulation of communications to organize a cartel of imagery and identity among themselves." Price goes on, "The sellers in this market are those for whom myths and dreams and history can somehow be converted into power and wealth, classically states, governments, interest groups, businesses, and others. The buyers are the citizens, subjects, nationals, consumers, recipients of the packages of information, propaganda, advertisements, drama, and news propounded by the media. The consumer pays for one set of loyalties or another in several ways that together we can call loyalty or citizenship. So as consumers, our loyalty to the government could be expressed in our willingness to pay a high tax rate. The government promotes this loyalty through the media, through patriotic speeches and the public school curriculum and so on. Or by contrast, we the buyers might demand a low tax rate so that we can buy drugs, in which we are expressing our loyalty to the drug industry, which is another seller, right? They place ads to win us over, try to get us to associate their brand of alcohol or cigarettes with a narrative of success and self-fulfillment and sexiness in order to ensure our loyalty. In this example, the government and drug industries are competitors for our loyalties, right? They both want our money, and we have only so much in the bank. However, these different sellers sometimes form alliances, or other times they refuse to compete on kind of a level playing field and try to restrict each other's access to the market for loyalties. So the government would be doing this if they made it illegal to run cigarette ad campaigns during children's television programmings. At least that would be Monroe Price's interpretation of this, right? That government regulation isn't necessarily about serving the general interest, but about kind of creating a monopoly or a cartel of loyalty. We often hear from free speech activists that political communication is or should be a marketplace for ideas in which the best ideas rise to the top because they get the most supports, like innovative products in other kinds of market systems. That's also the way that Habermas would like the public sphere to work, right? Everybody debates things and the best ideas rise to the top because they make the most sense or serve the most people. But Price says, look, the marketplace for ideas sounds nice. It's right out of kind of Adam Smith's dreams, but that's precisely the problem, is that free markets are something that don't exist actually in pure form in the real world. You see free competition kind of here and there in pockets of the market, but that competition is always both limited by and actually maintained by regulation. And what you see at least as often in the real world economy as a perfect free market, probably more often, is anti-competitive behavior. Right? Different sellers don't just compete with each other, but they also collude, for example, by forming cartels and limiting who else gets to compete with them and on what terms.
Well, the most serious anti-competitive agreement is what we call a cartel. And that's the situation where a number of competing businesses get together and basically decide, let's not compete with one another.
Here's how Price explains that the free marketplace for ideas is just one kind of marketplace for loyalties. Quote, "The marketplace of ideas is a particular incarnation of the market for loyalties, one that has an established definition and a history of proponents and detractors. An active, thriving bazaar with atomized buyers and sellers, the marketplace of ideas is, in its purest form, free of anti-competitive conduct. Ease of entry is assumed, and the government plays a limited role, if it plays any role at all. Because truth is thought to prevail in the resulting competition among ideas, no government regulation of competition is justified. The market for loyalties as a model more closely approximates actual market practice than does the marketplace of ideas. Like the marketplace for goods," and I think he actually made a mistake here, and what he meant to say was, like the marketplace for goods, the market for loyalty frequently reflects monopolistic and oligopolistic practices, including efforts by competitors to exclude new entrants. This market often, but not necessarily, operates at the country level, though it's a market undergoing a process of contested globalization, just like markets for other goods and services these days. Using technologies, new sellers make bids for loyalties, nowadays often across borders, and more established sellers often scramble to catch up and try to impose new regulations to keep out those new sellers, those new competitors whom they find threatening. So, for example, a private television industry in a country might form a cartel with that country's government. Together, they draft new legislation restricting who gets to use broadcast frequencies inside the country's borders. Maybe it's only companies that are locally owned, so that clearly serves the domestic TV industry's interests against foreign competitors. And let's say that the legislation also mandates that every channel must devote a certain number of hours per week to patriotic public service programming, which serves the government's interest. Maybe the opposition political party, another player in the game in this country, informally allies with those foreign broadcasters who want to enter the market. Maybe they also ally with foreign human rights and press freedom organizations and with foreign governments by arguing that this new law would violate universal principles of free speech. So as opposed to the Marxist model, where power and control over the media is essentially concentrated in a unified ruling class, in the market for loyalties models, things look more complex. We have actually lots of different powerful interests competing with each other for audiences' loyalties, trying to fence each other out sometimes, maybe forming cartels and kind of economic marriages of convenience with one another in order to gain an upper hand, for example, through media regulation. Price first developed this theory in the late 20th century, before the internet became such an important medium for global communication. But I think the last several pages actually of his 1994 article, "The Market for Loyalties, Electronic Media, and the Global Competition for Allegiances," are unbelievably prescient in his predictions about how the media and also global politics were going to change in the 21st century. It's almost like history written in advance. You should give it a read if you haven't already. So I think the concept of the market for loyalties is still very relevant and useful. If we consider, for example, arguments about hate speech on social media, about how laws passed by the government and also policies made by platforms themselves, like Facebook and Twitter, should regulate speech, preventing hate speech while allowing freedom of speech somehow, or striking a balance between those two. So if we look at these debates, we can understand both those saying regulation is needed and those presenting themselves in this debate as free speech absolutists, as sellers in the market for loyalty, trying to gain an advantage over their competitors. Price's theory also helps us understand why sometimes the same people might think regulation is necessary in some cases, but not in others. The European Union governments are worried about the self-proclaimed Islamic State, right? Another rival seller of images and narratives. They're worried about ISIS winning over the loyalty of some of their citizens. EU citizens worry that their citizens will go and join the caliphate or stage attacks domestically, and so they pressure social media companies to remove content supportive of ISIS. When companies or other organizations or political factions reject internal regulation, they can likewise be understood as attempting to shape the market for loyalties in their favor. So, for instance, within the EU, again, some political parties on the far right don't mind censorship of ISIS propaganda, but are furious when inflammatory white supremacist and racist disinformation gets taken down by those same social media sites, or when there's threats in government to pass laws restricting that kind of hate speech, because that content is helping the far-right parties to gain loyalty, to, in this case, to win more votes. Those far-right political parties might come up with kind of elaborate justifications for the proper and logical balance between free speech and risks of harm, but Monroe Price would view those justifications as first and foremost self-serving. Price also wouldn't be surprised in the least at those parties' attempts to convince social media companies that they can't afford to alienate right-wing users and lose ad revenue, right? That's pretty typical behavior, actually, for trying to form an alliance with another player in the game, another seller in the market that helps you gain a competitive advantage. And this example really gets at the high stakes involved in efforts to control the market for loyalties. At stake is the very stability of political systems, not to mention all the people who could potentially get killed in either ISIS attacks or attacks by white supremacist groups. Another thing that I like about Monroe Price's model is that it can help us kind of not be so shocked all the time by hypocrisy, by people talking high-mindedly about free speech one day and then endorsing censorship the next, right? Hypocrisy is only shocking if we assume naively that people naturally kind of act according to consistently applied ideals. If we think about the same people instead as sellers in the market for loyalties, then of course, depending on your evolving market position, on whether you're trying to disrupt an established market or consolidate gains and advantageous position, and depending on who your competitors are, your strategies are going to be in constant flux, right? You won't necessarily be applying consistent principles. So what Price has in common with the Marxist tradition is not taking people's arguments about why they're doing what they're doing or about what's right and what's wrong at face value. Right? This goes back to the concept of base and superstructure. Our general starting point for analyzing the news and the way it's regulated, according to this thinking, should not be to presume that people are motivated by ideals or the pursuit of truth, right? Instead, ideas, political rhetoric, culture as a whole, these are kind of superstructural to the base of real market interests. Ideas about the proper regulation and balance of control over the media might be presented in terms of universal rights or collective well-being, but as Marx taught us now almost 2 centuries ago, the favorite trick of groups trying to seize power or remain in power is to present what benefits them as common sense and principled and beneficial to society as a whole.